In this video, we'll be talking about the imaginary number I. So, what is the imaginary number? Well, if you've ever tried to take the square root or any even root of a negative number, you would probably get that the answer is, well, there's no real answer. So, for example, if you have to find the square root of negative 5, in the past you would have said there is no real solution. And that's actually correct. There is no real solution, but in fact, there is an imaginary solution. Now, why on earth, I'm sure you're asking, why on earth would you have to know about imaginary numbers? Like, isn't it enough to just deal with real numbers? Well, when you are dealing with more advanced mathematics or physics or engineering, sometimes you have to deal with imaginary numbers in order to get to a real solution in the end. So that's why we're learning how to deal with imaginary numbers today. So, what is an imaginary number? What is I? Well, I is defined as the square root of negative 1. It follows then that I squared would be this value squared. So therefore, it's just negative 1. We could keep going with this and figure out what I to the third is. So I to the third would be I squared, which we already know is negative 1, times I. So I to the third is this times this, which gives you negative I. And finally, I to the fourth is I squared times itself. I to the fourth is I squared times I squared, which is the same as negative 1 times negative 1. So I to the fourth is actually just 1. All right, so these four things here, we have to know. So we are going to have to know these. They're going to have to be on instant recall. So for example, just like how you know that 1 plus 1 is 2 or 2 times 2 is 4, you're going to have to know these four things. So we're going to take these four things and we're going to work with them eventually. Okay, so bringing back the example that I had on the board just a couple minutes ago, in our example, we had to find the square root of negative 25. So again, in the past you'd say, well, square root of negative 25, there's no real solution to that. But now we know a little bit better. The square root of negative 25, well, does that have a factor with a nice, wonderful square root that we can easily find? Yes, it does. The square root of negative 25 is just the square root of 25 times negative 1, which we've learned is the same thing as saying the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1. Now, we already know the square root of 25 is 5. And from what we just learned about the definition of I, the square root of negative 1 is I. So what have we just learned? That the square root of negative 25 is actually 5i. Alright, we could have done this with a shortcut. We didn't have to go through all those steps. So for example, the square root of negative 9, well, because there is a negative under that sign, we know that there has to be an I there. And we just find the square root of 9, which is 3, and so it's 3i. Let's try one more before we move on. How about the square root of negative 2? Well, the square root of negative 2, we don't have a nice even root of 2, but that's okay. We can just write root 2i. Alright, so that's how you use the I. Let's take it one step further. Okay, so in this example, we're going to add and subtract imaginary numbers. The good news is that when you're dealing with imaginary numbers, that I behaves just like a variable. It's actually super easy to work with. Alright, so we already know from what we just learned that negative 16, the square root of that, is 4i. Minus, and then negative root negative 49 is actually just 7i. So again, when working with I, we can just treat that I as if it's a variable. So 4i and 7i are like terms. So 4i minus 7i gives us negative 3i. Okay, so now we're going to look at multiplying imaginary numbers. Now, recall that when we were working with real numbers, so if we had root 4 times root 25, we could just multiply these things and it would be fine. That is not allowed when working with imaginary numbers. So do not turn this into the square root of 100. No, that is not correct. That is not correct. All right, so we can't just multiply what's under the radical here. We have to first change it to its imaginary form, which is fine because you know how to do that now. So the square root of negative 4 becomes 2i, and we're going to take that and we're going to multiply by the square root of negative 25, which is 5i. All right, when we take 5i and multiply it by 2i, we get 10i squared. Now, you may recall the 4 facts that we spoke about earlier. I'll put them back here. We know that I is the square root of negative 1. I squared, that's I squared, is equal to negative 1. I to the third is equal to negative I, and I to the fourth is equal to 1. All right, so we have I squared right here. And according to these facts that we know, or we will know very soon, I squared is negative 1, which means that this is just 10 times negative 1. And so we have our answer as negative 10. Okay, so now we're going to look at how to simplify a fraction if it has an imaginary number in the denominator. So here we don't actually see that there is an imaginary number in the denominator. We see a radical in the denominator, which we're totally not okay with. So we have to, when simplifying something with a radical in the denominator, get rid of that radical. So when we do that, we get 6 over, and we see here that is actually negative, so it is the square root of 2i. So here we still have a radical in the denominator. We have this imaginary number in the denominator as well. In order to get rid of that stuff, here is the rule. Let's write it down. We need to square the denominator to get the radical and the I out. And that's just because we're simplifying it, and when we have to simplify a fraction, we don't want a radical in the denominator, nor do we want an I. Alright, so we're going to multiply both the bottom and the top by root 2 times I. So we're squaring the bottom, but whatever we do to the bottom, since we're multiplying it by root 2 times I, we have to do the same to the top. So we get that this is equal to 6 times root 2i over root 2i root 2i. Well, what is that equal to? Let's put it down here. 6 root 2i, and if I multiply root 2 by root 2, I get 2. And if I multiply I by I get I squared. Alright, we're getting warm here. Now, remember the 4 things that we should know. I'll put them down here. I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. I to the third is negative I. And I to the fourth is 1. Alright, so now we have that I squared here. We can take care of that. And we get that this is equal to 6 root 2 I over 2 times negative 1. Now 2 goes into itself once, and into 6 3 times. We have a negative sign here, so it makes this entire thing negative, and we get that this whole thing is equal to negative 3 times root 2i.